Hey there, this is Jacob Wood with Douglas Elliman Real Estate, and I'm here with Daniel Churgin, real estate attorney with Sutton Sachs Meyer here in Manhattan. And Dan is kind enough to share with us his expertise on how things are going, how business is being transacted here during the quarantines. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Absolutely. Now, our we can't show right now in person anyway. And of course, the economic circumstances are what they are.
Sure.
Have people been buying homes over the past month?
Yeah, I think you're seeing a number of different types of buyers. The first being the investor class. The investor class, especially if they're conducting the back half of a 1031 exchange, they have to complete a purchase. Otherwise, they're going to have to incur some kind of capital gains exposure for their taxes. You're also seeing a lot of people who have been in the city for a long time, or maybe not even that long, but the city is no longer for them. So you're seeing them either have to sell to move to the suburbs or the Hamptons or wherever they would like to go. And you're also seeing them then on the other side of that, they're pretty aggressive about buying. Recently, I was involved in a transaction in the Hamptons where the purchaser had the right to live in the property from the day he was in contract. It required obviously a bit more of negotiating an agreement between the parties, and a much larger than a normal 10% deposit for the contract. But we were able to get it done within a few days. He was very desperate and aggressive to get out of Manhattan and get situated in the Hamptons, and we were able to get that done for him. And then, last but not least, I think you're seeing people who, regardless of what's happening in the world, it was time for them to move. I know some friends of mine who I represent. They have growing families and they've outgrown their space. And it's funny, they were in contract to sell and they don't even have a place to end up. So they're currently staying, I think, with their parents. And they plan on, when it comes time to close on the property they're selling, everything goes into storage and they will continue to stay with their parents.
Gotcha. Okay. And how have you noticed a flight from Manhattan to upstate or to the Hamptons here over the past month or two?
Well, you're certainly seeing a lot more interest, I think, in the Hamptons and upstate, only because there's less fear involved with getting in to look at properties. There's also a lot less complexities when it comes to the due diligence process. That's something that's been incredibly challenging because managing agents are not really equipped to provide access. The ones who are, they might email you the minutes, but those seem to be the exception rather than the rule. So we have ways of working around these things, but it definitely does seem like the tide is turning against living in Manhattan to some degree. Though people are still looking at Brooklyn, I think the allure of having any kind of personal outdoor space is what sells properties these days.
Okay. And so it sounds like individual situations can complicate the purchase and sale process greatly for individual clients. But by and large, how would you say the purchase process and the sales process has changed as a result of the quarantine?
Right. Well, I think the most noted difference is for closings. Either I have power of attorney and I sign all the documents on behalf of my clients, whether they're buyers and sellers, and they get sent to a title company, or we will arrange for a socially distant closing environment where I will sit in a conference room at a title company or bank attorney's office and sign all the documents on behalf of my clients while the title closer's in another room and the bank attorney is in yet another room. That is definitely the biggest difference. We've been lucky enough to have email, to do our contract negotiations. We can get in touch by email, phone, whatever it takes to get the deals done. But I sort of miss the personal connection of getting to go to a closing with my clients, and at the moment it's over, getting to congratulate them. It's a little anticlimactic when you do a remote closing, because it's not like you hand the checks over at the end of the closing. It's wires that go out, and wires are notorious for having issues here and there.
I understand. Yeah. So much of how we accomplish our jobs is person to person.
Sure.
And, things are tougher when, we're anyone who works in the service industry, which at the end of the day we do, that connection is part of why we're here.
Right.
And so, yeah, I understand that it's not only complicated for our clients, but complicated for the professionals as well.
Right.
I mentioned,
realistically,
Mhm.
we're able to close multifamily properties, single family properties, condominiums. But where I have not yet had a closing for any cooperative apartments because of the reliance on managing agents. Now, what I have seen is I've received notices from other attorneys who now represent the managing agent, and they will handle the escrow portion of the closing. But because cooperatives rely so much on the uh, handing over of the physical stock and lease at closing and picking up the checks in return, it has been a lot more complicated because of that. The other bigger change we've seen is obviously coronavirus and epidemics and pandemics are at the forefront of people's minds. So you're having to negotiate provisions that we never had to before, related to coronavirus contingencies, for lack of a better word.
I see. Okay.
And generally
Mhm.
those will depend, the nature of one of those provisions will depend largely on what a particular client's concern is. I've had clients who are concerned about being hospitalized, and the language will be if they're hospitalized for a minimum number of days, or, God forbid they pass away, they have the right, or their estate would have the right to cancel the contract and the down payment will go back. We've also been seeing a lot more provisions related to loss of income, especially when it's related to the extension of a mortgage. Under normal circumstances, if a buyer has a mortgage, even if a buyer has a mortgage contingency, and they lose their job after getting the loan commitment letter, in most cases, they're stuck in the transaction and don't have the right to cancel. But we're seeing a shift away from that these days, where buyers are rightfully so saying that if they lose their job because their business has laid off or furloughed workers as a result of the coronavirus shutdowns, that they then have the right to get their down payment back. And it's just a matter of getting very specific, precise language to cover those circumstances. You don't want ambiguities at the end of the day when it comes to something like this.
Right. Understood. Now, what it sounds like is some managing agents will email board minutes, but absent that, is there any access to managing agent's office to read board minutes? And I know a lot of buyers might not know that the standard is, those sorts of things are done in person, one time only.
Right.
Are you seeing a lot of flexibility with that, or if you still need to go to their offices, is that something you have access to right now?
I've had a number of transactions that sort of got going and then fell apart in early to mid-March, which required reading of minutes. And it was sort of I would say like a 30-70 split, where 30% of managing agents had figured out that it wasn't a good idea to have exposure to additional people, and they were content to have me sign some kind of non-disclosure agreement and send me the minutes. And other managing agents, well, they stuck by their principles and their policies, and no minutes were forthcoming. And I actually would, go in person, mask, gloves, and the whole nine, and review minutes in a managing agent's office. Now, obviously, if the managing agent's offices are closed, we are able to put together basically a board minute contingency, where we have the opportunity to review the minutes when they're made available to us. We'll still get into contract, we'll still pay the down payment.
Okay.
And then if we find something that is material, which is somewhat of a loose term, we would have the right to either enter into some kind of renegotiation with the seller rather, or cancel the contract.
Understood. Even in that scenario, you're assuming the timeline works out where you have access to the board meeting minutes before it's time to close.
Right.
Which may not necessarily be the case.
Right. Well, and it's a matter of doing what you can. You have to understand sellers are still going to receive letters and notices and memos from their managing agent. And you can just ask the seller to forward anything that they've received from the managing agent. It's a pretty typical condition that the seller is under an ongoing obligation to send those kinds of notices to the buyer, even once you're in contract, but they can provide a good deal of color. You have to understand you're still able to review the offering plan and the financial statements, and you can ask some questions to the managing agents. The ones who aren't at work every day, they seem eager to have something to do.
Gotcha. Okay. And assuming you get what you need from the managing agent and you're able to put the purchase application together, are boards still reviewing purchase applications, and how's the interview process being conducted?
They are, and I can't speak too generally about boards. Boards are as unique as any individuals. So some boards are open to having interviews over Zoom, like we're speaking now. But other boards, I've heard of interesting boards asking for people to stand on the sidewalk in front of the building while the board shouts answers from the second story window, and they have an interview that way. You can still have access. You're just probably not going to have people sitting in a room together with masks and gloves. I just don't see that happening for a while. But I've had a number of co-op buyers and sellers have their deals canceled because the boards are just turning people down. I guess they're operating under the assumption that they would rather stick with the occupants that they have rather than letting new people in. And, once you get sort of past that hurdle, then you're also seeing situations where boards are reluctant to allow move-ins and move-outs because they don't want to have exposure from the moving companies and cleaning companies and anybody else who may have to come and get the apartment ready for the purchaser.
Understandable. Okay. So even best case scenario, and you are lucky enough to be granted a board interview, you may find yourself standing on the sidewalk in the neighborhood where you're hopefully about to live, with the board member shouting from the third floor, "Please explain the $20,000 deposit made into your account on the 17th of January. Okay.
You may find yourself in that position, and we all have to be flexible in everything we're doing these days, and that's just another area where we'll have to take it with a grain of salt.
Gotcha. Okay. And with purchases contingent on financing, have you noticed banks tightening their lending standards or having trouble funding loans that were previously confirmed?
Yeah, we've seen, sort of to your first question, we are seeing a move away from the 10% down payment in terms of loan to value of the property. There was an expansion of that, I would say, in the 6 months before coronavirus, where you could just put 10% down, finance 90%, get some mortgage insurance, and you were fine. But you're seeing large lenders like Chase, they're now requiring 20% down payments. And I recently had a closing that got adjourned a week because the loan commitment letter was issued under one set of parameters, and then the bank tightened their lending guidelines, and they had to reconfigure the loan, and my client had to liquidate some additional assets in order to complete the loan. And obviously it was a bit of a hurdle to get over, but we were able to work through it, and it just took a bit of coordination between the title company and the lender and myself, obviously with my client's help to submit what he needed to submit. But yeah, we were able to get these things done, and and things come up in transactions. The terrain seems to be shifting beneath our feet almost constantly. So it's just a matter of being flexible and adaptable and doing what it takes to get the transaction done.
Understood. Okay. Now, I've heard anecdotally from different bankers at different institutions that some are grandfathering in older qualifications if someone was pre-approved in January and got loan commitment a month or so, sometime in February, and they're coming to close, even if they would not necessarily meet banks' newer standards, banks are going ahead and funding the deals. But some banks aren't doing that. That's been your experience?
Yeah, that my experience is more in banks that aren't.
Okay.
Obviously, whether a bank is willing to make an exception or grandfather in a loan, it's going to come down to the relationship between the buyer and their lender, and whether or not the loan officer is going to be able to get the kind of exception granted.
Hmm. Okay. Now, the quarantine and everything that is coming with this pandemic, extending the closing process is understandable. And it sounds like buyers are finding themselves in the positions where uh, 3 months ago, when they went into contract, they did so in one market. And
Mhm.
now that they're ready to close, they're closing in quite a different market.
Right.
If I'm in contract to sell my home and my buyer is asking for a discount, because after all, the market is softer,
Right.
how common is that? And do I have to give them one?
Well, you're seeing it a lot. What you have to remember is a contract is an agreement between the parties, and the down payment on that contract is security for the performance by both parties under that contract.
Hmm.
So the buyer asking for a concession, they're more than welcome to ask. They're not necessarily entitled to get any kinds of concessions. Now, if you have a situation where they have a financing contingency and the market has changed such that the appraisal comes in lower and they're not able to get a loan commitment without some kind of price adjustment, obviously there's going to be some room there.
Hmm.
I have seen at the higher ends of the markets situations where um, my buyers believe that prices have dropped by more than 10%, and they feel emboldened under those circumstances to ask for concessions with the understanding that they could walk away from their 10% down payment and find a comparable property for 15 to 20% less, thus appreciating a savings of 5 to 10%.
Hmm.
Now, if you're lucky enough to be in those price range echelons, good for you. And by all means, there should be some aggressive negotiation. But I think in the 2 million and below, there's not really that room to make those kinds of deals.
Right. Okay. And how are closings being conducted differently now than pre-pandemic?
Right. Well, it's really up to the attorneys to coordinate with their respective parties. If I'm the seller, I've got to get the deed and the transfer tax documents and whatever else might come in from the condominium and title company. I've got to get those signed days in advance, and I've got to get those sent over to the title company for review and approval, so that when it comes time for the buyer to do their part, which is to sign the transfer tax documents and whatever condo documents, the buyer also has to wire the money to the title company, and the title company will pool all of the money, the payoff, the broker's commissions, the payoffs for the banks, and proceeds that go to the seller plus the title expenses. They'll pool all the money together and then distribute it once the closing is complete. That is definitely the biggest change, and it's not like we sit down at a closing table for an hour and a half and we stand up at the end of it and the closing is done. It's
Hmm.
a bit more of, well, did the wire, we get on our phones or we email and inquire politely about whether the wires have hit yet the respective accounts. And once that happens, the title company holds the documents. The other thing, and this is a bit more in sort of the weeds, is that documents are not currently able to be recorded. And my biggest concern coming out of this is that we're going to see a number of closings that have occurred that may be missing a document or two to get recorded by the city clerk's office. and we're going to have to reconvene, chase down some clients who we haven't spoken to in a month or two, and ask them to re-sign some documents.
I see. Okay. And well, overall, how would you say the quarantine has affected sales volume? And surely it has, but how many fewer deals are you doing now than say 2, 3 months ago?
Substantially less. I wish that weren't the case, but I still advise my clients. I tell my partners, any of the colleagues I speak to, we're still at the tip of the iceberg. We're still under a state of emergency in New York, and we're going to come out of this, and transactions are going to have to happen. People who have not incurred that much of a financial hit from this are going to have the wherewithal to get out there and buy. And I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities to do so, because you're going to have either people who own in Manhattan and think that now is the time to leave, and you're going to have people who have been sitting up on money and think that now is the time to spend it. So I think transactional volume will go up. It's just going to be a matter of adjusting to the new normal, as it were.
Understandable. Okay. Yeah. I mean, our busiest calendar months are particularly are usually typically March, April, and May.
Right.
And not only sure, there have been market forces discouraging transactions, but much moreover, we've been forbidden to do the nuts and bolts that are necessary to transact. So I think some pent up demand, at least initially being released, is to be expected here. Mm-hmm. Whenever the world is allowed to begin turning again.
Yeah, I can imagine there are a lot of young families who are in 1 or 2 bedroom apartments that they've long outgrown, and they've been quarantined together for 2 or 3 months, and it's the walls, if they haven't closed in on them already, will close in on them soon. So I can imagine there's going to be a lot of turnover in the market, and I think it's it may be delayed by a few months, but we may see a good summer.
Understandable. There's going to be a lot of couples not living together that are going to consider now to be the time, and there's going to be some busy divorce attorneys here over the next few months. So the forces that have always spurred the market will continue to do so after all of this is over, and even before all of it's over, because who knows when it's actually going to be over.
Right.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and arranging this with me. It's been very educational for me. And I know it's going to be educational for the buyers and sellers watching as well. So thank you.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Okay.